The fog was so thick that soldiers could barely see their own rifles. Radios crackled with fragments of German voices drawing closer by the minute. 300 exhausted men waited for death on a lonely mountain road, unaware that their survival now depended on one radio operator with a forbidden talent. Corporal Elias Ward had never imagined that his strange gift would matter in a real war. Before the world collapsed into fire, he was just a quiet farm boy who spent long nights twisting the dials of an old shortwave radio, mimicking every foreign voice he heard. His mother thought it was harmless fun. His father thought it was useless. But Elias loved the challenge of shaping his voice, copying accents, copying tones, copying rhythms until he sounded exactly like the people coming through the static. When the army drafted him, that hobby became a problem. Commanders warned him repeatedly that impersonating enemy voices on official channels was forbidden. One mistake could trigger friendly fire. One wrong phrase could expose positions or mislead units trying to survive. By the winter of 1944, Elias served with the 76th Infantry Division, pushing through the dense hills near the German border. Their radios were fragile, batteries weak, and enemy transmissions flooded the waves every night. Still, Elias listened carefully, absorbing everything he heard from German officers barking orders, tank commanders giving coordinates, and panicked infantry shouting for reinforcements. He memorized their patterns without ever speaking them out loud. Regulations were clear. Mimicking the enemy was strictly prohibited, but everything changed when his battalion was ordered to hold a narrow snow-covered pass west of Call. The terrain trapped them like insects in a bottle. German forces surrounded the ridges. Artillery echoed from every direction, and their supply lines were sliced apart by enemy patrols. 300 American soldiers huddled behind frozen rocks with almost no food, almost no ammunition, and absolutely no way out. The radio was their last lifeline, but every hour German interceptors jammed it tighter. Elias could hear them closing in. Snow gusted across the ridge as Elias hunched over the radio, cupping his hands around the cracked metal casing to warm his numb fingers. Static hissed like a living creature, swallowing nearly every attempt to reach command. Lieutenant Harper paced behind him, boots crunching in the snow, jaw clenched tight with the weight of 300 lives. The lieutenant had fought in North Africa and Italy, but he had never seen a situation collapse this quickly. Their maps were useless. Their scouts were trapped behind enemy lines. Their artillery support had gone silent hours ago. The only thing they knew for certain was that a large German force was maneuvering toward the pass from 3 directions. Elias adjusted the frequency again, listening to the ghost-like murmur of German chatter slipping between bursts of interference. The more he listened, the more he realized how well coordinated the enemy was. Tanks were rolling toward the eastern slope. Infantry squads were preparing to probe the western trail. The biggest danger was a reinforced company of German grenadiers advancing straight toward the bottleneck. If they reached it, the Americans would be crushed against the rock walls with nowhere to fall back. Elias relayed what he could, but every message was broken, distorted, or swallowed completely by the jamming. Lieutenant Harper tried to call for help repeatedly, but the signal never reached higher command. The men shivered behind their foxholes, rifles tucked beneath their coats, to keep the bolts from freezing. Some whispered about trying to slip out under the cover of darkness, but Harper shut down that idea instantly. The trails were too exposed. The Germans had machine gunners positioned to cut down anything that moved. Their only chance was to hold and hope for reinforcements. Hours passed like years, and the fog only thickened. Elias kept scanning frequencies while the lieutenant studied the valley through binoculars coated in frost. Then, just past midnight, Elias heard something that made his stomach tighten. The Germans on the northern ridge were preparing an assault. They spoke calmly about moving into position, waiting for signal flares, and advancing with full strength. It was a plan designed to overwhelm. Elias repeated the translation for Harper, who exhaled slowly and looked over his exhausted men. They had maybe 20 minutes before the attack began. No reinforcements were coming. No artillery was coming. No cavalry was riding up the ridge to save them. If they stayed in place, they would be wiped out. If they tried to retreat, they would be gunned down on the trails. The pass was a DEATHTRAP. Harper asked Elias whether he could pinpoint the enemy commander's position. Elias listened again, narrowing his eyes as the radio crackled with clipped German commands. He could hear the man giving orders with a steady confidence that only experienced officers possessed. Elias recognized his voice from earlier transmissions. This commander was sharp, disciplined, and methodical. He also leaned on specific phrases that revealed his strict training. Elias had spent weeks memorizing the patterns. Every vowel, every inflection, every clipped consonant lived inside his mind. Harper placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, something between trust and desperation. The lieutenant didn't need to say the words. Elias already knew what he was thinking. There was one option left. One dangerous, prohibited, court-martial-worthy option. Elias stared at the radio for a long moment, heart thundering in his chest. If he spoke in the German commander's voice and got it wrong, the enemy would instantly recognize the deception. If he got it right, he might buy the Americans precious minutes. The fog swallowed the ridge as the German assault force prepared to move. Elias took a breath, feeling his entire life narrow into a single impossible moment. Elias steadied his breath as he positioned the cracked headset over his ears. The cold metal pressed against his skin, sharpening his focus. Around him, the men crouched behind their foxholes, rifles ready, eyes wide with fear. They tried to hide. Lieutenant Harper watched silently, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would decide whether 300 lives ended on this ridge or saw another sunrise. The fog shifted like a living curtain, hiding the German assault force preparing to strike. The radio crackled. Elias heard the German company commander checking on the readiness of each platoon. His voice was confident and crisp. Elias closed his eyes, letting the sound settle into memory. Then he reached for the transmitter with trembling fingers. Every rule he had been taught forbade this. Impersonating enemy command could trigger confusion, misfires, or worse. But if he did nothing, the Germans would hit the pass with overwhelming strength. So he exhaled slowly, placed the transmitter close to his mouth, and began to speak. His voice slipped into perfect German, matching the commander's tone, rhythm, and clipped inflection. He issued a calm but urgent order for all units to halt. Movement. He claimed reconnaissance had spotted Allied artillery preparing to shell the valley, and any advance would push them directly into the kill zone. For a second, there was only static, and Elias feared he had failed. Then a distant voice responded, hesitant, asking for confirmation. Elias stayed in character, delivering the same stern impatience he had heard from the real commander earlier. In the night, he ordered them to divert eastward immediately and avoid the pass entirely. Another silence followed. Then, one by one, the German platoon leaders acknowledged the change in orders. Elias opened his eyes, hardly believing what he heard. Lieutenant Harper leaned closer, his expression a mix of disbelief and hope. The men around them dared not even breathe loudly. If the Germans discovered the deception, they could reverse course and attack with renewed fury. But for now, they were moving away from the pass, slipping deeper into the fog to reposition for an imagined artillery threat, as minutes stretched into tense eternity. Elias continued to monitor the enemy communications. He reinforced the false order, redirecting an entire German assault company without firing a single shot. His heart pounded against his ribs. Every word felt like walking on a tightrope stretched above a battlefield. If even one German officer noticed something unusual, the illusion would collapse. Yet the impersonation held steady, his voice unwavering. The accent flawless. Harper put a hand on Elias's shoulder again, firmer this time. The lieutenant whispered that they needed to move before the Germans realized there was no artillery waiting for them. With the enemy force diverted, the pass was no longer a trap, but a narrow window of escape. Harper ordered the men to pack silently, leaving anything too heavy to carry. Exhausted soldiers hauled themselves to their feet, gripping rifles, supporting wounded comrades, and following Harper's signal down a steep path that had seemed suicidal only an hour before. While the men advanced down the ridge, Elias stayed behind a few moments longer, repeating the false orders to buy more time. The fog helped hide their movements, wrapping the retreating column in protective darkness. Only when he heard the German voices drift far enough east did Elias step away from the radio. T slung it over his shoulder and hurried after his battalion. The escape had begun, but it was far from over. The Germans would eventually realize the truth, and when they did, 300 men would be hunted through the frozen hills. By the time Elias rejoined his men, the fog had thickened, swallowing the shapes of the ridge. He could hear the distant clatter of tanks and motorized infantry as the German column veered away from the pass, their engines echoing like thunder. Over frozen hills, the men of his battalion moved silently, every footstep calculated, every rustle in the underbrush a potential alarm. Yet, despite the cold biting through their uniforms and the weight of exhaustion pressing on their shoulders, a glimmer of hope pulsed through them. They had survived the immediate threat, thanks to the voice in the static. Elias's mind raced, even as he marched. He replayed the transmissions over and over, each phrase of German command etched into memory. Every subtle hesitation, every clipped consonant, every authoritative inflection had mattered. He had become a phantom commander, leading enemy forces down a path of his design, and it had worked. But now the real danger had shifted. The Germans would soon realize that something was amiss. They would investigate, search, and retaliate. And if they did, the battalion was still exposed, moving through unfamiliar terrain with wounded men and dwindling supplies. Survival demanded more than luck. It demanded constant vigilance. Lieutenant Harper fell in beside him, glancing at the younger radio operator with a mix of admiration and worry. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" he murmured, voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Elias nodded, knowing that explaining it would take hours and probably invite a reprimand, or worse. "We just bought ourselves hours," Harper continued, "but hours can save lives. Keep moving. Keep your head down. The Germans will be back on track soon, and they'll be looking for this battalion." The lieutenant's words carried the weight of command, but also the unspoken acknowledgement that Elias had carried out an impossible task. As they descended the ridge, the battalion passed through groves of leafless trees, their branches scraping like skeletal fingers against the soldiers' coats. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified. Elias kept one eye on the horizon, scanning for any sign of German pursuit, and one ear tuned to his mental replay of the radio exchanges. He knew that their survival depended on maintaining unpredictability. They could not be caught in the same patterns the enemy had expected. Every turn, every detour, every carefully chosen stopping point had to feel natural and necessary. Hours passed, and the battalion moved steadily through the frost-hardened terrain. The men whispered quietly among themselves, sharing brief words of reassurance. Some of the younger soldiers, barely 19, were pale with fatigue, their limbs trembling from exhaustion. But Elias's presence, a mix of tense focus and calm determination, kept a fragile order among them. He was no longer just a radio operator. He had become a guardian of strategy, a silent orchestrator behind every move they made. In the distance, the sounds of the German advance began to fade. Smoke from distant artillery rose into the sky, but the battalion's immediate path remained. Clear relief washed over Elias, but only for a moment. He knew the fog could not hide them forever. He knew that the German officers would eventually piece together what had happened. And he also knew that his role in deceiving them was a secret. He could never reveal, not to anyone, not to command, not even to Harper. The consequences of discovery would be catastrophic still in that frozen morning. As the first rays of weak sunlight struggled through the fog, the battalion pressed forward. Their survival, for now, hung on the balance of courage, cunning, and the dangerous gamble of a young man who had broken every rule to bend the enemy's will. Elias understood that history might never know their story, that no medal would be awarded, no parade held. But the thought of 300 men waking to fight another day, lives spared in the cold shadow of war, carried its own quiet triumph, and so they moved silently through the frost and fog, carrying with them the fragile hope that the most dangerous battles were sometimes fought not with guns, but with courage, deception, and the mind of a single, determined soldier. By mid-morning, the battalion had reached a hidden ridge beyond the German line of sight. Exhausted men collapsed against rocks and snowdrifts, their breaths steaming in. The cold air, and for the first time, a fragile calm settled over them. Elias moved among the soldiers, checking on their injuries, passing water, and offering brief words of reassurance. They didn't know exactly why they had survived, only that the advance they had feared never came. The rumor of German movement had been replaced by silence, broken only by the distant boom of artillery far from their location. Relief washed over the men, but it was mixed with tension. Every soldier knew that survival in this frozen hell was temporary, fragile, and earned by more than luck. Elias withdrew to a secluded spot, crouching behind a snowbank. He replayed every detail of the night in his mind. Every phrase he had spoken, every pause he had timed, every subtle manipulation of the enemies. Expectations, it had all worked. He had taken German command and bent it to his will, turning a potential massacre into a narrow escape. And yet, the victory felt hollow. Each thought of Klaus and his crews stirred a complex mix of relief, guilt, and moral ambiguity. The men who had survived owed their lives to deception and the calculated deaths of others, a reality that weighed heavily on him. Despite the inner turmoil, Elias understood the broader picture. Without his intervention, the battalion would have been annihilated, and the course of the engagement might have altered the entire front. He documented everything in a private notebook. Not for recognition, not for medals, but for the record of what had happened, if only for himself. He noted German radio frequencies, timing patterns, officer behaviors, and the subtle cues that had allowed him to manipulate them. This document, he knew, was his invisible medal, a testament to courage and ingenuity under impossible circumstances. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Harper moved through the ranks, organizing the men for the next phase of the campaign. He glanced at Elias, recognizing the young radio operator's exhaustion, the visible strain on his face. Harper didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He understood that Elias had done something extraordinary, something dangerous, and that the battalion owed its lives to that quiet, decisive act. The unspoken respect between them solidified in that frostbitten morning. A recognition that heroism often existed in shadows and silence. As the sun climbed higher, the battalion began to regroup and prepare for movement back toward safer positions. Supply lines were still tenuous, the enemy unpredictable, and the winter relentless. But the men moved with renewed determination, fueled by the knowledge that they had been given a second chance. Each step was measured, cautious, but filled with the quiet confidence of survival. The horrors of the previous night had been avoided, but Elias knew that the war was far from over. Every soldier had a role to play, and every action carried weight. Elias stayed close to the radio equipment, aware that his skills might be needed again. Though the immediate threat had passed, the war demanded constant vigilance, cunning, and the ability to act decisively when rules failed to protect lives. He reflected on the night's events, realizing that the line between obedience and ingenuity was razor-thin. By breaking the rules, he had preserved life, proving that sometimes courage was measured not by following orders, but by understanding when to bend them. In the cold light of dawn, the battalion rested, tended to wounds, and began preparing for the next march. The forest, still heavy with snow, whispered in the wind, as if carrying the echo of a silent guardian. Elias felt the weight of responsibility settle in his chest, a reminder that survival in war often relied on individuals willing to take impossible risks. History might never record his actions, medals might never appear, but the knowledge that 300 men lived because of one radio operator's daring would remain with him forever. Etched into the fabric of the frozen battlefield, the battalion would move on, fighting battles that the world would see and remember. Yet the true victory of that December night, the invisible, calculated heroism of Elias, would remain hidden, a quiet testament to the courage of one soldier who became more than himself to save others. As night fell again over the frostbitten forest, Elias sat alone in his temporary command post, a faint glow of the radio equipment casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. He had expected a brief respite, a chance to rest after the previous night's high-stakes gamble, but the war was never so forgiving. A new transmission crackled through the headset, unfamiliar and urgent. The voice was German, clipped and impatient. A panzer officer reporting that the destroyed column had delayed reinforcements. The frequency confirmed it. This was not a routine patrol. Something had shifted in the enemy's operations, and Elias realized immediately that his deception had created a ripple far larger than anticipated. The battalion had survived the minefield ambush, but now the enemy was reorganizing, adapting, and the danger had only multiplied. Elias' mind raced. Every detail of the German command structure he had memorized could now be leveraged again, but the stakes were higher. Any mistake could undo the lives he had saved, and the enemy had likely tightened their radio discipline. After the mysterious destruction of their column, he pulled out the notebook he had managed to hide, cross-referencing frequencies, timing, and officer behaviors. Every calculation, every pattern, had to be perfect. Failure would not only mean death for the men under his command, but could compromise the broader front. He adjusted the dials, tested the transmitter, and listened carefully. The enemy chatter was heavy with uncertainty. Operators questioned orders. Commanders sought clarification, and for the first time, Elias sensed hesitation at the very top of the chain. He could exploit this, but only with extreme caution. Minutes stretched into hours as Elias prepared. He recorded a new series of phonetic cues, meticulously rehearsing the exact inflections, the pauses, and the accent of the Prussian officer he had impersonated before. He knew the enemy was suspicious now, and any deviation from the expected pattern could trigger disaster. Sweat and frost mingled on his face as he whispered the phrases repeatedly, committing them to memory. Then he set the frequency for the narrow window of opportunity, 20 minutes before the real orders would arrive. Time was slipping, and every second carried the weight of life and death at precisely 02 to 7 hours. Elias keyed the transmitter. His voice sliced through the static with authority, calm and unshakable. Eisenfaust 4, here, Panzergruppe Command. Iron Fist 4, ready to receive. The response was immediate, just as he had predicted. Breathing, hesitation, recognition. The officer, on the other end, accepted the orders without question. Elias' pulse hammered in his chest, but his hands remained steady. Carefully, he redirected the panzer unit once again, not toward the American battalion, but toward a frozen valley far from friendly lines. where terrain, mines, and weather would immobilize them. Every command was plausible, every justification. Tactical, he had learned to exploit their trust in structure, hierarchy, and pattern, turning it into an invisible weapon. The tension was suffocating. He could hear the officers' subtle doubts, but his words soothed them. A masterful deception crafted over days of observation. The minutes ticked by as the German column acknowledged, repeated, and executed the orders. Elias stayed on the line just long enough to confirm compliance, then released the transmitter. The silence that followed was deafening. He had done it. Another annihilation avoided. Another 100, perhaps more, lives preserved by a single, calculated act of courage and intellect. But he knew better than to relax. The enemy could still realize the deception at any moment. And his exposure would be catastrophic. Every shadow seemed a threat, every crackle of static a warning. Elias' mind was alert, focused, analyzing, predicting, calculating. The battlefield had shifted again, and only those who could anticipate the next move would survive. The frozen forest, illuminated by the pale moonlight, seemed almost still, but Elias knew that elsewhere. Massive tanks rumbled, men moved, and lives hung in the balance. The night had become a chessboard, and he was both player and piece, maneuvering invisible forces with precision, intelligence, and nerves of steel. The enormity of what he had just accomplished pressed down on him. The weight of morality, the calculation of lives, the sheer audacity of bending enemy command to his will. And yet, he had no choice. In war, decisions were rarely clean. The difference between survival and death often depended on understanding the line between obedience and initiative. And Elias had walked that line to save those who could not save themselves. The first light of dawn had not yet broken, and the forest remained cloaked in a dense, frigid mist. Elias crouched low in the shadow of a ruined barn, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air from the previous night's explosions. He allowed himself only a brief moment to breathe, knowing full well that the war did not pause to grant him relief. His radio crackled faintly, and he instinctively adjusted the dial, ears straining for any hint of German movement. Every static burst, every whisper over the frequency could be a sign that the enemy suspected the duplicity of the orders he had sent. Yet nothing, only the soft hum of the cold morning, broken occasionally by distant shouts and the scraping of boots over frost-hardened soil. Despite the exhaustion gnawing at his limbs, Elias knew he could not afford inattention. The battalion he had saved the night before would soon mobilize, and reinforcements were still days away. He had created a temporary reprieve for them, but the enemy was far from finished. Intelligence reports trickled in, fragmentary and unreliable, leaving gaps that only he could fill by listening, analyzing, and acting. The lesson of the last night had not been lost. Initiative, courage, and knowledge could outmaneuver superior numbers. Still, the price of error was immense. One misstep now, one misread pattern, and the fragile advantage he had engineered would collapse into catastrophe. Elias crouched closer to the radio, replaying every interaction he had observed in the German command. Each officer had their rhythm, their hesitation, their tiny tell that revealed a subtle panic or confidence. He had learned to identify these nuances, and they were as crucial as the physical terrain of the battlefield. The more he studied, the more he realized that war was as much about understanding the human element as it was about firepower. Tanks, bullets, and mines were tools, but comprehension of the mind, the expectations, the habits of men could be a weapon far more decisive. He noted the minor inconsistencies in their transmissions, an officer's voice slightly strained after hours of command, a mispronounced call sign, a hesitation before acknowledging orders, and plotted the next move. Accordingly, through the gray haze, he glimpsed movement. A small patrol of German scouts skirting the edge of the forest, likely unaware of the ambush that had befallen their armored column. Elias' pulse quickened, but he forced his breathing to slow, matching the rhythm he had observed in disciplined. Officers, patience was critical. Even one rash action could reveal his position. He reached for his notebook, the pages slightly damp from frost and sweat, and began cataloging the new observations. Every detail, times, frequencies, tones, responses, was another piece of the puzzle. In a few hours, this information could allow him to intercept further orders, misdirect additional enemy forces, or alert American units to avoid imminent danger. The stakes had shifted, and he had to remain several moves ahead to ensure survival, as the sun's first pale rays began to pierce the mist. Elias allowed a grim satisfaction to flicker within him. The previous night had proven that audacity could save lives, that intelligence and courage could tip the scales when brute force alone would fail. But he also understood that the reprieve was temporary. The Germans were reorganizing, adapting. And the battlefield was fluid. Any sense of permanence would be a dangerous illusion. He tightened his coat, adjusted his cap, and checked the radio one last time. Every channel, every frequency, every subtle pause in German chatter could hold. The key to survival or a signal disaster. His mind, sharp despite exhaustion, was already calculating contingencies, preparing for another confrontation that would test his ingenuity, courage, and resolve once more. Elias' eyes scanned the horizon. The pale winter light reflecting off frost-covered trees, and he reminded himself the game was not over. The enemy may have been deceived once, but war would always demand more. And he was ready. The explosions that had rocked the Belgian countryside the previous night had left a ghostly silence in their wake. Smoke curled in thin spirals over the frost-hardened terrain, the acrid scent of burnt metal lingering in the air. Elias remained in his concealed position, listening intently to the subtle noises of movement across the snow-covered ground. The battalion he had saved was mobilizing now, alerted by the distant blasts that masked his interference. They moved. Cautiously, weapons ready, yet unaware that their survival owed everything to a single, daring act in the darkness. A man impersonating the enemy to manipulate fate itself. Through the radio, faint static filled his ears. Elias meticulously tuned the frequencies, listening for any sign that the German high command had detected the deviation in orders. None came. The enemy seemed confused, disoriented by the sudden annihilation of their column. Reports would later show destroyed tanks, confused officers, and operational failures that defied explanation. For now, Elias held his breath, knowing that each moment of silence was temporary. The battlefield would continue to shift, and he could not rest. The calculus of war demanded constant vigilance. He noted the absence of radio chatter in expected frequencies. German officers were likely rerouting, assessing losses, and issuing orders under duress. The disruption he had orchestrated was proving effective. But he also understood that victory was not complete. It was a temporary reprieve. Hard-won, fragile. Elias' mind replayed the sequence of events from the night before. Each decision weighed, each pause measured. The impersonation had been flawless, precise, yet it had not come without moral cost. He had sent men, German soldiers, knowingly into death, exploiting fear, and leveraging the patterns of human psychology to redirect an unstoppable force. Each decision had been calculated, and yet, in the quiet aftermath, the weight of responsibility pressed upon him like the frost-laden earth. He had saved lives, yes, but at the cost of others who would never understand the truth. This paradox would remain with him always, a silent burden born in a frozen foxhole and etched into memory. Nearby, American units began to regroup, cautiously. advancing to assess the aftermath of the destruction. The once imposing German tanks lay in twisted, fiery wreckage, some still smoldering. Artillery crews, alerted by the detonations, were already preparing defensive measures, unaware that their enemy had been deceived by a voice in the static. Elias allowed himself a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but tempered it immediately. Pride could be dangerous in such circumstances. Vigilance remained essential. He meticulously catalogued every observable change, movement, terrain alterations, smoke patterns, even the faint groans of injured men hidden beneath metal debris. These observations would prove invaluable if further engagements followed. In war, survival relied not only on firepower, but on knowledge, observation, and the capacity to anticipate the enemy's response. By mid-morning, the first light had fully illuminated the snow-covered landscape. Elias remained vigilant, watching as the battalion he had saved established defensive positions. He noted the subtle movements of officers, the methodical checking of equipment, and the cautious optimism in their step. They were alive because of his actions, yet none would ever know. Medals would not be awarded, reports would not mention. His role and the history books would likely record the destruction of the Panzer Column as an anomaly of wartime chaos. Elias felt no bitterness. He understood that heroism was often unseen, unrecognized, and unrewarded. The significance of his actions was measured in lives preserved, not accolades. As the day progressed, Elias allowed himself a single thought. Survival and vigilance, cunning and courage had changed the course of the day. The battlefield had shifted, for now, in favor of the Americans. Yet he knew this was not the end. War never truly ended. It only paused, reshaped by the decisions of men who dared to act when rules failed them. He adjusted his coat against the bitter wind, rechecked the radio, and prepared for the next phase. The game was ongoing, and he would continue to play, guided by observation, instinct, and the quiet knowledge that, sometimes, the most decisive actions were the ones no one would ever see or understand. The sun had barely risen over the frost-laden trees when a faint, ominous hum reached Elias' ears. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but his trained instincts recognized it immediately. The remaining German reconnaissance units were moving, probing the American positions, searching for weaknesses in the line. The previous night's chaos had slowed them, but not stopped them. The Eisenwehr battalion had been decimated, yes, but fragments still moved, radioing for support, and there were other units in the area that could capitalize on the disruption if allowed to regroup. Time was slipping, and Elias could feel it, pressing against him like the frigid air that stung his lungs. He crawled toward a vantage point atop a snow-dusted ridge, the weight of the captured radio strapped carefully to his back. He could see the faint shimmer of German vehicles moving through the tree line, their engines muffled by the early morning fog. Every detail mattered. Elias had 4 options: alert his own forces and risk revealing his unauthorized role. Attempt another impersonation to manipulate enemy movement, remain hidden, and let events unfold. His mind raced, calculating probabilities, patterns, and potential outcomes. There was no room for hesitation. One wrong choice could mean disaster. Elias crouched, scanning the frequencies he had memorized over the past tense hours. His previous success had been a calculated deception. This one would require improvisation. He tuned the dial, catching snippets of German chatter. Orders were being relayed in fractured bursts, officers communicating confusion over disrupted routes, some questioning the reliability of their destroyed columns. Elias recognized the voices, some he had not heard before, others familiar from reconnaissance calls. He needed to act quickly, using the same technique that had saved the 300 men. He began to plan, voice patterns echoing in his mind like a complex musical score. Timing was everything. One misstep, one mispronounced syllable, One off-pattern pause, and the Germans would recognize the anomaly. Suspecting deception, he whispered instructions to himself, imitating the precise cadence of the panzer officers he had studied. Each syllable carried authority, each pause designed to mirror the Germans' habitual hesitation and timing. His hands moved with trained precision, adjusting dials, calibrating frequencies, and checking signal strength. He visualized the enemy. Commanders in their armored vehicles, poring over maps, awaiting instructions, unaware that a single American corporal was dictating their next moves. A bead of sweat froze on his temple as static filled the airwaves. Then it happened. A familiar, raspy voice cut through the interference. It was Klaus, or at least the voice Elias had learned to recognize as such. Iron Fist 4, report. Elias' heart pounded, but his mind was cold, calculated. He responded immediately, delivering orders that redirected the remaining German units into terrain rife with American mines and defensive positions, ensuring maximum disruption without overexposing his own forces. Each instruction was deliberate, tactically sound from a German perspective, yet deadly in reality. The enemy complied without question, conditioned by their own military doctrine to trust familiar cadence and pattern. Elias monitored as vehicles veered. Crews muttered under breath, and confusion began to spread among the remaining forces. The deception was working. Yet the tension was suffocating. Any slip, an incorrect grid reference, a pause too long, a word mispronounced, could undo everything. The minefields ahead were real, and American artillery was ready to strike. He felt the moral weight of manipulating human lives crush against his chest. He was playing God in a snow-covered forest, commanding men who believed they were following orders from their own high command. Minutes stretched like hours as Elias continued to broadcast, weaving tactical commands with the perfect intonation and authority. Vehicles disappeared into hidden minefields. Explosions echoed faintly in the distance, and smoke began curling from unseen destruction. His nerves were taut, senses honed, calculating each heartbeat, each movement, each transmission. By the time he ceased transmission, the last of the German reconnaissance units had been diverted or incapacitated. The battlefield had shifted once more in favor of the Americans, and Elias' skill, nerve, and audacity had achieved another monumental victory. He sank into the snow, exhausted beyond measure. Every muscle ached, every thought raced, yet the relief was tempered by the awareness of what he had done. He had again deceived the enemy, but at a human cost, one he would carry with him forever. The frozen forest was silent now, save for distant groans of machinery and wind across the snow. Elias had mastered the unthinkable. He had become the enemy, manipulated them, and ensured the survival of countless men, all while remaining invisible in history's records. The forest was quiet now. The immediate danger passed, but Elias knew better than to relax. Survival in the Ardennes wasn't measured by a single victory. It was measured in moments, in seconds, where a single decision could tip the balance between life and death. He pulled his coat tighter, the snow clinging to his shoulders, and scanned the horizon. The German forces had been disrupted, yes, but the war wasn't over. There were still pockets of resistance, patrols that could stumble upon his position, and the ever-present threat of discovery by American officers who wouldn't understand. His actions, he allowed himself a brief mental replay of the night's operations. Every broadcast, every syllable, every careful pause that mimicked the panzer officer's inflection, it had worked. The Eisenwehr battalion had been destroyed, diverted into prepared kill zones. 300 men had woken that morning alive, unaware of the silent hero who had saved them. But the moral weight remained. He hadn't simply redirected tanks. He had orchestrated the deaths of enemy soldiers who trusted him to obey orders. And though they were the enemy, he felt each life as a shadow pressing against his conscience. War demanded decisions like this, he reminded himself. Yet it didn't make them easier. His thoughts were interrupted by a distant rumble, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't artillery or tanks. It was American vehicles moving through the snow. Reconnaissance and supply units checking the aftermath of the chaos. Elias slipped deeper into the shadows, watching them pass, his presence invisible. He had memorized every path, every ridge, every blind spot that could betray him. After 4 days of observing enemy patterns, he had become a ghost in his own environment, blending seamlessly with the frozen landscape. Even as the immediate threat passed, he couldn't stop analyzing. His mind raced through every possible consequence of the night's operations. Intelligence officers would debrief the events, but what could he reveal? That he had impersonated enemy command. That he had dictated orders that directly caused the destruction of an entire battalion. The official story would never credit him. In fact, it might never acknowledge the outcome correctly. And yet, he had done what needed to be done. 300 men were alive because he had acted where protocol forbade him. Protocol, he realized, was a distant luxury in moments of survival. Elias moved cautiously through the forest toward the nearest American outpost, carrying the captured German radio with him. Each step was deliberate, calculated to avoid detection, each breath a cloud in the frigid morning air. He thought about Captain Morrison, the stern officer who had confiscated his equipment the previous night, enforcing rules that could have cost lives if followed blindly. Morrison had believed in procedure over initiative. Elias had learned that sometimes courage meant stepping outside the lines. Breaking rules that were meant for order, but not for survival. The distant sun cast long shadows across the snow, revealing glimmers of frozen artillery shells and discarded equipment. Elias's gaze lingered on a half-buried German helmet, its insignia peeking through the snow. He had spent 4 days listening to the enemy, learning their patterns, anticipating their actions. Every detail had been catalogued, every voice remembered, every hesitation noted. He realized the enormity of what he had achieved and the risk he had taken. One wrong move, and he would have been nothing more than another frozen casualty in the Ardennes. He finally reached the outpost, slipping the radio into the cover of a supply crate. His heart slowed slightly, but the tension lingered. Victory was never final in war, and the Ardennes still demanded vigilance. But for the first time in days, Elias allowed himself a small measure of reflection. He had become something more than a radio operator. He had become a strategist, a manipulator of fate, a man who wielded knowledge and voice as weapons. And, though no one would ever know the truth, the lives he had saved were proof enough. The snow fell steadily around him, muffling sounds, turning the world into a monochrome landscape of white and shadow. He pulled his coat tighter, letting the cold anchor him, reminding him that survival was temporary and fleeting. His work was far from over, yet he felt the smallest glimmer of hope, or a knowledge that courage, intelligence, and audacity could, even in the deadliest of battles, make the difference between life and death. Elias paused at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the forest that had become both battlefield and classroom. He would move carefully, continue to observe, continue to anticipate. There would be more transmissions, more orders, more men to save or lead astray. The Ardennes was far from conquered, but he had carved a mark into its frozen landscape, a mark invisible to all but those whose lives had been spared. The snow had stopped falling, but the frozen Belgian landscape remained silent and unforgiving. Eddie Voss huddled in his foxhole, the stolen German radio buried beneath a thin layer of dirt and equipment. His hands still trembled from the adrenaline, but the critical task had been completed. 40 German tanks, led by the cautious commander, Klaus, were now unknowingly heading toward minefields, their fate sealed by a voice in the static. Eddie allowed himself, brief moment to process the enormity of what had just happened. The moral weight of his actions settled on him like the icy mud surrounding his position. He had saved 300 American soldiers, yet the price was the lives of men who, like him, were doing their duty. Each blast that echoed through the frozen night would claim trained crews, officers and men who trusted the orders they were following. Eddie didn't feel victorious. He felt the heavy, silent burden of responsibility, the grim calculus of war. This was not glory. This was survival earned through deception, fear, and risk. Hours passed. Eddie listened to the forest, the distant hum of artillery, and the occasional crackle of enemy communications that no longer mattered. His mind raced, retracing every step, every sound he had memorized from Klaus and his officers. He thought of Captain Morrison and the confiscation of his notes and radio. Morrison had acted according to protocol, and Eddie knew better than to expect gratitude or acknowledgement. Yet in the quiet, he found solace in the knowledge that lives had been spared. Sometimes, in war, the right action was invisible to all. But the one who dared take it, Eddie reviewed everything in his mind. The precision of Klaus's voice, the pattern of his breathing, the hesitations that had allowed him to manipulate the enemy's decisions. He realized that understanding human psychology had been as important as knowing German. Trust, fear, and routine could be weaponized. He had not fired a single shot, but he had orchestrated a battle's outcome from a distance of miles, relying on nothing but observation, intellect, and courage. By dawn, distant explosions lit the horizon. Eddie did not celebrate. The destruction was far from distant. It was real, tangible, and deadly. Yet he recognized the outcome as necessary. 300 men would wake to fight another day, unaware of how close death had come. Eddie's mind returned to the moral paradox. He had destroyed to preserve, deceived to protect. In that foxhole, surrounded by silence and snow, he understood that heroism was not always public. Sometimes it was private, lonely, and morally ambiguous. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the Belgian countryside, Eddie allowed himself a long exhale. The radio lay dormant, the notebook gone, and yet his memories were intact. Every detail recorded in his mind, every pattern analyzed and applied. He would carry this knowledge with him for the rest of his life. Perhaps no one would ever know his name or the actions he had taken that night. But the lives of 300 soldiers bore witness in ways that words never could. Eddie's focus shifted to survival. The Battle of the Bulge raged on, and he had to remain alert. The stolen radio, the patterns, the timing, it was all gone from his hands, but not from his memory. Every subsequent decision, every order he followed would now be influenced by what he had learned in those 4 harrowing days. Eddie realized that the war was not only fought on the front lines, it was fought in the mind, in choices made under impossible pressure, in moments where morality collided with necessity. The foxhole felt less like a trap now and more like a vantage point, a place where Eddie had glimpsed the true complexity of war. He had broken the rules, deceived the enemy, and risked his life, yet he had acted with purpose and precision. In the aftermath, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes survival, courage, and ingenuity mattered more than orders, protocol, or recognition. And in that understanding lay both the burden and the reward of what he had accomplished. The morning light revealed a landscape both tranquil and scarred. Snow blanketed the earth, hiding the marks of destruction beneath a deceptive. Calm Eddie Voss climbed out of his foxhole, his body stiff and numb from the cold. Around him, the forest seemed unchanged, almost serene. Yet he knew that in the shadows and mines lay the aftermath of his orders. The German panzer column had driven straight into American defenses he had orchestrated through deception. And the consequences, both moral and practical, settled heavily on his shoulders. News of the destroyed German battalion reached the higher command within hours. Reports were chaotic, conflicting, and ultimately incomprehensible to those who hadn't been there. Intelligence officers analyzed maps and notes, scratching their heads over the apparent miscalculation of the Germans. How could a battalion have advanced directly into lethal terrain? Radio malfunctions were cited. Bad weather, miscommunication. No one suspected that a lone corporal had acted outside every regulation and protocol to redirect the enemy into minefields. Eddie listened to the reports in silence, feeling a mixture of relief and isolation. His actions had worked, but no one could know how. Captain Morrison approached him later in the morning. This time, he came without MPs, carrying the confiscated notebook that had vanished overnight. Eddie's heart skipped a beat as Morrison handed it over, studying the pages carefully. The captain's expression was unreadable, a mask honed by years of war and discipline. Intelligence found something interesting, Morrison said, his tone neutral but loaded with unspoken acknowledgement. The German panzer column was destroyed exactly where your notes predicted, except they weren't supposed to be there. Eddie said nothing. He didn't need to. Morrison's next words confirmed the truth he already knew. The intelligence chain would never be able to publicly recognize his actions. The reality settled in. Eddie had saved lives, yet his heroism would remain invisible. No medals, no commendations, no official recognition. The war would move forward, indifferent to the silent, calculated act that had shifted the fate of 300 men. He felt the weight of anonymity pressing down, a paradoxical mixture of pride and hollow solitude. In war, the truth often remains buried, obscured by layers of bureaucracy and protocol. Eddie now understood that some victories are never recorded. They exist only in memory and consequence. The psychological toll began to manifest. Eddie replayed every detail of the night in his mind. Klaus's rasping voice, the hesitation that allowed him to intervene. The precise timing, the minefields, the explosions. It was a victory, yes, but it was not clean. Every image, every sound, was a reminder of lives lost and decisions made that only he fully understood. In saving 300 men, he had become the executioner of dozens of others. The duality weighed heavily, a reminder that in war, morality is often measured in shades of gray rather than black and white. As he moved through the snowy landscape toward his assigned duties, Eddie noticed how the battlefield had changed. The terrain bore the scars of fire and explosions, blackened craters marking the spots where men and machines had fallen. Soldiers he passed spoke quietly, unaware of how close they had come to death. Their ignorance was a gift, yet it amplified Eddie's solitude. He carried the secret alone, knowing that revealing it could destroy his career. Or worse, lead to court-martial or death for disobeying regulations. By midday, Eddie had returned to routine duties, maintaining communication lines, training new radio operators, and repairing equipment. The world continued to turn as if nothing had happened, indifferent to the frozen night that had changed the course of a battle. He had become both invisible and indispensable, a ghost operating behind the front lines. He realized that war does not reward ingenuity or moral courage. It rewards obedience, and only occasionally, by accident. Survival aligns with ethics. Eddie understood that the foxhole had changed him forever. He had seen the intimate mechanics of command and fear, had manipulated human psychology to avert disaster, and had borne witness to the fragile boundary between life and death. The experience left him wiser, yet profoundly alone. It was a lesson in responsibility, a reminder that sometimes the weight of one decision could alter countless lives. And that heroism often comes cloaked in silence. In the quiet of the snowy Belgian morning, Eddie resolved to carry on. he would continue his duties, invisible yet vigilant. Forever marked by the night, he became the voice that altered the fate of 300 men. The war raged on beyond the snow-covered forests of Bastogne, indifferent to the acts of courage that went unnoticed. Eddie Voss returned to his duties quietly, a silent guardian of communications, training new radio operators and ensuring the signals of war flowed without interruption. Yet the memory of that frozen night stayed with him, etched into his mind. With the clarity of the crackling radio and the German voice he had learned to command, no parades awaited him. No medals would shine on his chest. The lives of 300 men had been spared, yet the moral weight of what he had done, the deception, the manipulation, the inevitable deaths of others, remained entirely his. It was a heroism unrecorded, a victory invisible to history, carried only in the conscience of the man who made it possible. Eddie had learned a truth that many never would. Sometimes the rules must be broken to save lives, and sometimes the cost of survival is the solitude of secrecy. Years later, he would return home to Milwaukee, to a life of quiet routine, raising a family, working for the phone company, and living with the knowledge that on one December night in 1944, he had fought a battle unlike any other. He never spoke of it. No one could understand the precise measure of courage it required, the cold calculation, the audacity to become the enemy in order to protect his own. Eddie Voss passed away in 1987. A man who had fired no shots yet had saved countless lives through intellect, bravery, and defiance. History would never record the details of his act. Yet in that frozen foxhole near Bastogne, amid snow and silence, one man's courage had shifted the tide for hundreds. And that was enough. The world of war often rewards obedience, but sometimes it is the quiet rule breakers who write the true stories of survival. Eddie Voss had become one of them.